your angles can change on indentation. And this is only possible if you use the 4-mirror gonioscope. So that's a very big advantage. Also that it's quick and comfortable and easy to use. This is just a video, and I'd like to tell you that it's important that the room lights are off when you're doing gonioscopy. And also, as you just see, I will pause and just go back, that the slit beam height should also be reduced when you're doing gonioscopy, because we don't want the gonio light to impinge onto the pupil, because that will also constrict the pupil and it can inadvertently open the angle if it's appositionally closed. Now, as you can see, if the patient has had an anesthetic drop in eye, it's very easy to try and put this 4-mirror lens in close contact to the cornea. That's all is required to be done. But the challenge is initially when you're learning to do it, it's how much pressure you need to touch just the eye, just enough that there is no gap between the lens and the tear film, and not too much that you start seeing the folds in the cornea. And in the next few videos, I'll show you how you can tell that while you are doing the gonioscope. Look at this video, just to tell you the effect of light. Now, the moment you reduce the light, you can see that the angle structures are not visible. You open it, you can see the pupil constrict, and the peripheral iris is getting pulled towards the pupil, opening up the angle for you. So that is why room conditions and the light that is impinged onto the pupil is very important. Just look at it again. You can see the pupil is moving. Can you see this iris moves and shifts, and you can start seeing the angle structures in the angle. Of course, I'm just widening the slit beam as well as elongating it for you to see the effect. If the slit beam is very small, taking the video and for you to appreciate becomes a little challenging. Look at this one now. In this video, I want to highlight two things. One, can you see when I press and indent, you can see how the angle widely opens up. And when you relax the indentation and you don't press, you can barely see the anterior trabecular meshwork. And the moment you can see it's compressed, you can see up to the scleral spur. The important thing to notice, can you see this stria? Now these folds into the cornea only come when you're indenting. And the other thing to note is, initially, can you see here this air bubble formation? This is where you'll know exactly the amount of touch you require to get to see the angles adequately. So you just don't want just adequate touch so that you don't have the air bubble coming in. And when you press, you'll get the folds and the indentation effect on the angle will be visible. So this is a classical example on how a patient who has appositional closure and you indent the cornea with your lens and you can see the iris falling back and the angle opening up. It's also important to disinfect your lenses between patients. And now in the COVID era, of course, it is very, very important. So the important practice is that if you're using a lens with the gel, you have to rinse the gel under tap water, then we wash it with mild soap and water, and thereafter dry it with the dabbing it with a soft cloth, and then you can wipe it with a spirit swab easily available in our OPD or a 1% sodium hypochlorite, which we are all going to be using in the COVID era in times to come. And if you're using a 4-mirror, all you have to do is wipe it with a alcohol swab, and at the end of the day, maybe sodium hypochlorite. Before I go on and show you more videos and images, I think maybe we can just briefly touch upon the fact that how do we identify the angle structures? We are all familiar with what to look for. You know, Schwalbe's line is the termination of the Descemet's membrane, followed by anterior non-functional trabecular meshwork, thereafter the pigmented trabecular meshwork, which is the functional part, scleral spur, and then the ciliary body band. As you can see over here, this is the scleral spur, this is the trabecular meshwork, scleral spur, and ciliary body band. Sometimes it is very important that we are able to identify at least one landmark to start seeing things thereafter. And ideally, it's nice if you can learn the technique of making this corneal wedge on the slit lamp. When you make the slit beam very thin, you'll be able to see where the two images from the corneal anterior posterior surface kind of merge here to form the apex, and that's where your Schwalbe's line is. So if you actually see this gonio image, can you see this duplicacy of the reflex on the cornea, and there it meets over here. So this is your Schwalbe's line. Or for that matter, in this picture, you can see this is where the wedge is being formed. So you must identify the Schwalbe's line so that you do not sometimes make the mistake of picking up a pigmented Schwalbe's line as the trabecular meshwork. And once you've identified one landmark, you can proceed thereafter to see which are the other structures visible on the gonioscopy. There are, of course, many ways of classifying the stage of the angle opening or other changes that you see over there. I think theoretically, we all know that in all published papers and otherwise, you will either have the Sheffer's grading or the Spaeth classification. Now, in the Sheffer grading, primarily, we are looking at the widest angle is, of course, where you can see the ciliary body, and it's estimated to be about 35 to 40%. Therefore, going down where you reach a stage where no angle structure is visible, which is considered to be 0 degree. Whereas in the Spaeths, we are looking at the site of the iris insertion, the peripheral configuration of the iris root, as well as the angle width. But for practical reasons, how we document in our clinics is that we actually make either in our case sheets, which are physical case sheets, or in the electronic medical records, we try and label the 4 quadrants as superior, inferior, temporal, and nasal, and we write the angle structures up to what level are visible in these quadrants. Suppose in one quadrant you can see up to ciliary body band, you mention that. In the other it's scleral spur, you mention that. So quadrant wise, you write the structures up to which level it's seen. And the other information, like how pigmented is the trabecular meshwork, can be mentioned 1+, 2+, 3+. If you want to write something about high iris insertion or peripheral anterior synechial in particular clock hour, you can just draw it over there and write pass from 5 to 7 or whatever. Any other abnormality like neovascularization or foreign body or a pigment clump can be just drawn in that area. Also remember when you're drawing this, that you're drawing the mirror image. So it's important that what you see superiorly is actually in the inferior angle, but whatever you see on the right side is going to be on the right side of the inferior angle, and whatever you see on the left is on the left of the inferior angle. So it's just a mirror image, and also horizontal nasal also behaves the same way. So just to show you here, you can have the 2 eyes, right eye, left eye drawn like this, or your EMRs can also have it. Either you can mention it, what structures are visible, you can draw the pass, you can write the pigmentation. If you've done the indentation, if there's any change, you can show what you see without indentation and have the arrow and say on indentation, what angle structures are visible. So documenting what you see is extremely important because gonioscopy is not a one-time test. You have to keep doing it over time. Every time a procedure is done, let's say a laser PI, we have to repeat it to see what changes it brought in our angle status. Or we've done a trab, and after 2 months, 3 months, 6 months of trabeculectomy, we might want to evaluate the angle. Or even an open angle glaucoma, after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, can convert into an angle closure if the lens is constantly increasing in size and thickness and pushing the iris forward. So gonioscopy is a dynamic thing to be done at least once a year, if not more. So when do you do it? Ideally in every patient, which of course is challenging, but definitely in every patient which is coming to glaucoma clinic, either because he's suspected to have glaucoma or he's already labeled an established disease. Now, it's important to remember that in India also we know there are a lot of patients who are being labeled and treated as open angle glaucoma often have angle closure disease. So it's important that when you are seeing a patient and is re-establishing, you must do gonioscopy, whether it's a primary or a secondary disease. Patients who have family history, patients who've had trauma, blunt or penetrating for that matter, anybody who has a shallow anterior chamber, anybody whose pressures are raised, any atypical findings like neovascularization on the iris, pigment dispersion, pseudo-exfoliation, episcleral veins are looking very prominent, sphincter tears because of, or a rosette because of trauma. All these are indications that we have to do gonioscopy in these patients. So what do we achieve, or what all gonioscopy can tell us? So just to show you some examples, it can identify the mechanism, but also the more you will start doing gonioscopy, you'll start realizing that there can be variations in presentation. So if you look at all these, these 3 are all open angles, but a different appearance of open angles. One has very prominent iris processes, one has a lot of pigmentation, and here in this picture, the angle is closed. So the mechanism itself can be identified once you look at what you can see and what you cannot see without indentation. And then, of course, in dynamic gonioscopy, you will try to indent and further evaluate. So look at here. If you see this angle, when you try and evaluate, you can see no angle structures, and the wedge is disappearing into the iris root. And the moment you press onto the lens, you can see the angle open up, right up to the scleral spur. And by doing this in all 4 quadrants, you can evaluate if this appositional closure is present all 4 quadrants, 3 quadrants, 2 quadrants. So this helps you understand the extent of what we call at iridotrabecular contact, the appositional contact of peripheral iris to the angle structures. And this is what determines that these patients can benefit maybe with laser PI, or maybe even some of them, despite laser PI, can have residual appositional closure, which is another topic to discuss. But you have to look at it and see in how many quadrants you can see apposition and grade it. And hence the classifications like primary angle closure suspect or primary angle closure, they all depend on the extent of angle closure, which is appositional, and whether to do laser PI or not is also dependent upon the area of appositional closure. So as you can see over here, now this patient, if you were to look at in the first go, you can see this pigmentation, right? Very often we can think this is the trabecular meshwork, but the truth of the matter is that it's not. You just press onto this eye and you can see the trabecular meshwork lies beneath. So the pigmentation sometimes can be present on the Schwalbe's line itself. And that's where forming the wedge and making sure that you've indented also every patient to see the difference. Sometimes the dynamic gonioscopy can help us evaluate a lot better, right? So as you can see over here, otherwise we would have mistaken this angle as open angle, but it's not open, it's closed appositionally. But if you indent, it opens up. Another one, can you see over here? Now this is, I'm pressing, it's opening up. While we don't press it, the angles are closed. So this is a appositional angle closure. Now indentation also helps us differentiate between appositional and synechial. Look at this video. Every time we press, the iris falls back. You can see some areas the iris is stuck already, forming peripheral anterior synechial. And in between the iris, some of it falls back and you can see the trabecular meshwork opening up. So you can differentiate between synechial closure, whether it's completely not opening up, the synechial closure is very, very advanced, or you have patchy synechial closure forming, in areas, and rest of it is still appositional. So you can differentiate between the two and understand also the extent of closure. Gonioscopy also helps us pick up the amount of pigmentation, and if there's any abnormal pigmentation like pigment dispersion syndrome in pseudoexfoliation, post-trauma, post-surgery, and inflammatory diseases. Things like Sampolisi's line, as you can see, there's this pigmented line anterior to the Schwalbe's line, which can often be seen in pseudoexfoliation. Look at this patient. So in trauma, gonioscopy is extremely important to look at the extent of damage by identifying angle recession and cyclodialysis if present. Now, angle recession, we know, is basically the circular and the longitudinal ciliary body muscles which disintegrate from each other, whereas cyclodialysis is disinsertion of the ciliary body from the scleral spur. So you must differentiate the two. Here, what you'll see is the widening of the ciliary body band. Now, sometimes it becomes difficult if it's a 360-degree angle recession. So it's important to compare the two eyes so that you're able to pick up, like you can see over here, the widening of the ciliary body band is not there in the other eye. So angle recession, if it is only patchy in some quadrants, you can see the remaining angle and compare, there's this widening of the ciliary body band can be detected. And if it is 360-degree, it's always important that you do gonioscopy of both eyes so that you can see the difference and identify it. Sometimes you are surprised at the information a gonioscopy can give you. Like in this patient which was having uncontrolled pressures and had had injury which was repaired, if you do the gonioscopy and see, there's actually a foreign body in the angle. So it gives you a lot of information in situations. Or in this patient who had had a phacoemulsification and had recurrent inflammation on the gonioscopy, you can see that there's a very small remnant of nuclear fragment lying in the angle inferiorly. And that's the reason why there is rebound inflammation happening in this patient over time. So there is a lot of hidden information in the angle. If we can look at it with direct visualization, it often helps us identify the cause of raised pressures or other things happening in these patients. Sometimes post-surgery, like in trabeculectomy, you have blebs not functional or something. You must do a gonioscopy to see if your internal ostium is open, if there is iris getting stuck to it. If that is getting blocked, the needling is not going to help. What you have to do is work at this level. So as you can see over here, this is a patient with retrab. The previous ostium is closed, but the second ostium is working. And you can see the ciliary processes here through the ostium. So gonioscopy has lots to offer, right? Not just to diagnose glaucoma, but in continuous realm of treatment of these patients. Now let's look at it in a patient where you've done peripheral iridotomy. You want to evaluate what happened to the angle. An angle which was closed has now opened up without indentation. But in some patients, what will happen is that the angle still remains closed after PI, either because it's synechially closed or there is still residual appositional closure, which means you press it, the PI is patent, but you can still see that the angles open up on indentation. But this could be plateau iris, or this could be some other reasons for appositional closure, like thick lens or other mechanisms. So gonioscopy can give us a lot of information and help you pick up situations which will guide you what to do with these patients. In congenital and developmental glaucoma, some of the anomalies can be picked up if you do gonioscopy, and you'll be able to differentiate things like you have high iris insertion, where the iris fibers are getting attached to the area anterior to the Schwall baseline, like you can see in this patient of Axenfeld-Rieger patient. Again, you can see broad peripheral anterior synechial formation. Now, how do you differentiate these from synechial closure and angle closure, which is primary angle closure? Remember, in primary angle closure, you will have, without indentation, some areas closed with apposition and some synechial. But the moment you have an angle that without indentation, some areas are open and some are closed, this is not primary angle closure. This is secondary angle closure, either due to uveitis or ICE syndrome or something else, but this is not due to pupillary block. This is because of the anterior pulling mechanisms or some other secondary mechanisms, maybe neovascularization. So you have to make sure that without indentation, you have to look at the whole 360-degree angle and see the configuration that you are able to see. In neovascularization, not only does it help you to identify and pick up early neovascularization, but you can sometimes see just the blood in the Schlemm's canal or blood in the angle from the neovascular vessels that might be there for you to pick up. But it's also important to look at the staging of neovascularization, whether you're still in the open angle stage or you have synechial forming, like you can see over here. Synechial closure has already started. And very soon these patients zip up entirely and it becomes very difficult to control them then. So staging of, let's say, diseases like neovascular glaucoma depends entirely on your gonioscopy pictures. And treating them with anti-VEGF injections can be very helpful in the open angle disease, whereas in angle closure disease, very often you have to do surgical interventions. So gonioscopy has lots to offer us if we practice it in our day-to-day practice. You can see blood in Schlemm's canal, which might tell you go back and look at the raised episcleral venous pressure. Maybe the veins are dilated and you missed it on the slit lamp. So gonioscopy must be done in many patients to try and see and pick up what all you can see in various other spectrum of diseases that we see in day-to-day life. You can see over here in a patient post-VR surgery, emulsified oil bubbles sitting in the superior angle. All the newer ab-internal procedures, which are the minimally invasive glaucoma surgery procedures, also are done using direct gonioscopy lenses during the surgery. So it's very important that we learn to identify the angle structures and become comfortable using gonioscopes, because in the future, we all will be doing the newer procedures requiring our knowledge of not only appreciating the angle structures, but having the ease of putting these lenses onto the cornea and seeing the angles. So as you can see over here, a trabectome is being used in the, iStent is being injected into the angle. And here a trabectome is being used, all under the direct visualization of the angle using gonioscopes. Sometimes you want to see whether the tubes that you've inserted, like the AGV or the Express or Molteno or let's say Adi valve in India, you might want to see the internal position of the tube. If it's touching onto the iris and causing bleeding, or the tube is retracting, whether it's still there in the AC or not, you can't see it under direct visualization sometimes. So gonioscopy can show you that as well. In some patients where, let's say, an iStent or a small Hydrus implant is sitting there, or an Express tube which is covered with the iris, you will miss seeing it if you do not put on the gonioscope. So it's very important to understand that the gonioscope helps us evaluate not only the location and patency of these newer devices in the eyes. So to just summarize once, that gonioscopy is a reference standard and an inexpensive tool which is very rapid, and it allows us to have a direct dynamic visualization of the angle, and it helps determine the cause of glaucoma, the staging of glaucoma, and also allows us to dynamically understand, differentiate between appositional or synechial closure. So when gonioscopy can give us so much, why do we need more? Because it does have some limitations. So gonioscopy limitations are that it's a subjective technique. We know that very often two examiners still don't agree on their gonioscopic findings. There has to be some training involved in you to master this technique. As I mentioned already, that it can get affected by patient cooperation, light in the room, light impinging onto the cornea. And you cannot have a quantitative evaluation. It's subjective, and you're making your assumptions and writing on the paper what you see. So objectivity is missing in it. And there can be variability between examiners. And the biggest challenge is that you cannot see beyond the eyes. What is happening to the ciliary body? If there's any other mechanism that's causing glaucoma because of the posterior pushing, we will not be able to see it on gonioscopy. And also all the pathophysiology involved in angle closure, which is non-pupillary mechanism, is often missed by gonioscopy. And there are so many different classifications. To really have a standardization in quantifying angles becomes a problem sometimes. Even experienced examiners, sometimes when you look at their findings, you might find that they do not agree with each other's findings. And that has been proven and documented in the literature as well. So the reality is that glaucoma, unfortunately, is not widely performed due to these challenges. But as I mentioned, despite these challenges, gonioscopy has so much to offer that we must use it in all our patients. I think Dr. Prashant is going to talk to us about the imaging, and it does have a role in our present clinic scenario, whether it's the UVM or the anterior segment OCT, because we know that it's an objective method and adds on a quantitative analysis to just the quality of analysis that we get on gonioscopy. Though it is expensive, it can give us a lot of insight in the basic pathophysiology of glaucoma, because it can see the structures beyond the iris, especially the UVM. But the challenge here is that you have to know where the scleral spur is before you start evaluating and quantifying, let's say, the width of the angle or where the trabecular meshwork lies. And we know that in 30%, sometimes we are not able to identify the scleral spur on ASOCT or UVM images. So that's a huge limitation these tools have in the present scenario. And again, we are looking at just one image, one cross-sectional image to compare it from a 360-degree view that we can get on gonioscopy. So role of the imaging, as I said, is there for us to pick up things like plateau iris, ciliary body cysts, or there are any tumors in the ciliary body, lens thickness and lens vault. So yes, our patients where the cornea is hazy and you can't assess the angle, the imaging can help you, but in no way the imaging can be a substitute to gonioscopy. Now look at this. You can see an open angle on, let's say, the imaging, but the open angle has pigmentation, neovascularization, or has Sampolisis line. These are things you can't tell on an imaging by itself. So it cannot substitute gonioscopy, but it can help you in your basic armamentarium. So to again reemphasize that no imaging technique can surpass the visual information, but it can definitely be used as a complement. So to conclude, gonioscopy is an invaluable tool in diagnosing and managing your glaucoma patients, and routine gonioscopy is essential to master the art and differentiate normal from abnormal. Greater emphasis has to be made that we must make it a part of a comprehensive eye examination, and all postgraduates should be trained rigorously in using 4-mirror gonioscopes. And I hope you all have invested in buying one. It's worth $1 million because it lasts you a lifetime almost to maintain it. And imaging tools can help us, but they're not a substitute. And look at the cost comparison in having a tool that you can use every day in your clinic. And periodic annual gonioscopy must be done in patients where you're treating them over time, right? So to just conclude over here, and we can take questions to discuss that theoretically, of course, knowing how to do, what to look, how to classify, but practically as postgraduates, you're going to become the future, generation for our country to be treating glaucoma, and the burden of glaucoma is only increasing with the life expectancy going up. So there's a huge responsibility in your hands to diagnose and treat glaucoma, and I hope that you will take this in the to train further the next generation coming after you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. I think you have covered in detail all the key points related to gonioscopy. There are very few questions, but I think we do have time to take them. And Dr. Prashant? Yeah, you're there. So I think, so there are a few questions. Most of them have already been covered in your presentation, but there's a question, can we use gonioscope on keratoconus patients?
Of course you can. Theoretically, on keratoconus patients, one can even sometimes see because of the convexity of the cornea. But the truth of the matter is you can safely do gonioscopy in keratoconus. Remember, if there's an acute eye drops or any other corneal abnormality where you're worried that you can cause any damage, then you might have to become a little cautious. But otherwise, by putting a 4-mirror gonioscope on the eye, no harm is done and you can visualize the angle with ease.
Thank you. Ma'am, one more question. Is it 1% or 0.14% hypochlorite which is used to disinfect lens? This is another question.
Yeah. So if you look at even the guidelines issued by WGC and all, initially they were using 0.5% sodium hypochlorite, but with COVID era now, 1% sodium hypochlorite that is being recommended. But between cases, all of us practice using alcohol swabs, and even in the newer COVID era sterilization regime, we are still wanting to advocate that you use the small alcohol swabs available to wipe it because it kills all virus instantly. But a sodium hypochlorite can further make sure that you have made the lens very safe. We are using right now 1%.
Okay, I think, thank you, ma'am. There's another question about final grading on gonioscopy. Anything I'd like to share? Like, there are multiple grades. So what actually you are doing in your practice? Or
yeah, so as I showed you in the documentation, and I think most clinicians, Dr. Manish and Dr. Sinha can comment on it also, that most of us in our practical day-to-day life and even using it between doctors, let's say I've seen a patient and tomorrow Dr. Manish is seeing it, what happens is that in the standard format where we write in each quadrant, which is the last angle structure that was visible, is a standard format I think most clinicians follow, which I showed you in that slide where in documentation we write scleral spurs seen in the superior angle, let's say trabecular meshwork only pigmenting easily, then again scleral spur inferiorly and scleral spur temporally as well. So the last angle structure visible without indentation is what we write first, and then if anything is changing on indentation, we document it again. Any abnormality like an abnormal vessel or peripheral anterior synecdoche, you draw in that area and write it, which is possible in the EMR, which is possible if you're using in your hand, patient prescriptions, or in your hard files. The Sheffer and the Spaeth classifications are more helpful when you're documenting something for publishing it, or suppose you're a part of a trial or something, then yes, these classifications become useful. But for practical purposes, it is the angle structure visible. Dr. Manish, would you like to?
Same thing we follow, madam, because there are so many grading. If you mention 1, 2, 3, what actually means 1 is difficult to understand. So as you mentioned, we just write say trabecular meshwork. So the angle is open till trabecular meshwork or till scleral spur. So if anyone else also sees, he can understand till what structures were visible, and anything abnormality, any synechia, any new vessels and all can be documented, and we can also draw those findings in our file so that later on we can understand where was the location of new vessels. That is, I think, is the best in clinical setting. And as you have mentioned, gradings are more useful for studies. There's also a question that what is manipulative gonioscopy?
Yes, good you asked. I think in one of my slides it was mentioned, but I missed it. So manipulative gonioscopy is basically helpful in looking dynamically at the angle when you do not have a 4-mirror indentation gonioscope. Which is, again, I would strongly emphasize in Indian scenario that please use 4-mirror wherever you can. Avoid using two mirror or single mirror. But if you have only a single mirror or two mirror or three mirror Goldmann gonioscope, and you are visualizing the angle, and you want to see in an angle closed patient if the patient is only having appositional closure. So what we do is we tilt the mirror towards the angle that you're visualizing, trying to get a visualization beyond the iris bulb or over the hill view to see if the angle structures are visible beyond. That's called manipulative gonioscopy, where you're manipulating your hand and the tilt of the lens onto the cornea to try and see the effect of the visualization that can be appreciated beyond the bulge of the iris or the convexity of the iris. Now, this was something that was practiced in the era where we were not using 4-mirror lenses, but primarily doing 3-mirror gonioscopies or single mirror or 2-mirror Goldmann lens use. But now I think majority of us not only have moved on to using 4-mirror, but we are training our postgraduates and fellows to use only 4-mirror. And then the manipulative gonioscopy, has no practical role. But with non-indentation, you can use it to whatever information it gives you.
And one more question, madam. When do we say it's significant angle recession? So is there any criteria that when you call it significant, when non-significant?
When you're trying to document, of course, you write angle recession from 5 to 7 o'clock, 360 degree, nasotemporal quadrant angle recession. So you actually earmark the area, because this is not something that will progress over time. It can fibrose and change its configuration, but not that angle recession. If it is 6 clock hours, it will become 9 automatically. And how you evaluate this angle recession area to the risk of glaucoma is something that people say that if you have more than X amount of angle recession, higher chances. But then again, there are patients who have only 2 quadrants of angle recession and still develop glaucoma. So really telling you that 180 degree and less angle recession, the risk of glaucoma is little. The worry is that those patients get lost to follow up. So you document the extent, actually writing from this o'clock to this o'clock is the best way to document it, right? Which is very objective then for anybody else also to look back at.
We have already covered most of the questions related to grading, that what you've already covered. There's one other question. Is it possible to do gonioscopy in case of acute uveitis with circumciliary congestion?
Yeah. So if the patient is comfortable, see, right now, let me tell you that in our glaucoma clinics, it's a routine that when we put the patient on the slit lamp, we put a drop of paracaine and we stain the eye with fluorescein. Once we're taking the AT, thereafter, we actually put the gonioscope on the eye. And if the patient is comfortable and if he's very photophobic, watering, of course, maybe you can leave that phase and there is not enough information that you want immediately. You want to treat the inflammation and then you can access the angle. But if the patient is comfortable and is allowing you to take AT, you can easily do a direct gonioscopy, indirect gonioscopy using 4-mirror. Because the patient has no discomfort. Only if he's very tender, yes, when you indent and all, he can feel a little pain. And that phase can easily be treated with steroids and then gonioscopy can be done.
I think most patients can tolerate it pretty well, except like in very serious pain and all, those cases maybe we can put steroid, make the eye comfortable and do it later on.
So I think I forgot to mention one thing, that in blunt trauma, if there is hyphema, fresh hyphema, please wait for the hyphema to settle for a, and wait and don't do it immediately after hyphema has gone the next day. Sometimes the clot might be sitting in the angle, can rebleed. So in hyphema, maybe giving a few days gap to document angle recession and other things is worthwhile. But otherwise, in most conditions where patients are comfortable, you can put in the gonioscope.
Thank you, madam. I think the same applies to UBM also, which Prashant will be discussing, because we often get patients with hyphema referred for UBM to look for angle recession. So we can anyway wait for that. There's no hurry to check angle recession. Let the hyphema come down, let the acute stage go, and angle recession can be diagnosed later also. We have a few questions we'll take at the end. I think Prashant is already ready, and it seems like there's some issue with lighting and it is home. So, but anyway, Prashant, all set?
Yes, sir. All set. And there is no current here. That is why it's a little dark. I'm going to back.
Satyajit, are you around?
Yes, I am here.
So you like to formally introduce Prashant?
Yes. First, a big thank you to Dr. Reena Chaudhary for the amazing, beautiful presentation. I really wish she was my postgraduate teacher when I was doing my postgraduation. She has made it so easy.
It is difficult to believe, I must say.
I almost stood up and started clapping here.
So we
It
are
was such
very
an
kind
amazing
and
presentation.
very modest. Thank you, Ji. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The postgraduates of eye care must be benefiting so much from you.
Yeah.
Now, the next speaker we have is Dr. Prashant Srivastava, who is a glaucoma consultant at BBI Foundation. He is the ex-consultant at the Department of Glaucoma, Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai. He did his long-term fellowship in glaucoma from Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai. He is a life member of AIOS, Delhi Ophthalmic Society, GSI, and Ophthalmic Society of West Bengal. He has been an instructor and speaker in various ophthalmic forums, and he has publications in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Prashant, we are very grateful for your time and for all the effort that you're putting into this PG program. A very, very warm welcome to you. And I'd like Dr. Manish to take over to introduce him.
Yeah. I think Prashant, you can share your screen and we can have a discussion on ASOCT and UBM. And then at the end, we'll try to cover up, because both the topics are related to each other also. So we'll have Madam's opinion also about. Yeah,
Thank you so much, Satyajit sir and Manish sir, for inviting me and introducing me to this wonderful platform. And it's great to be here. So I'll be talking about the anterior segment imaging. So Madam has already discussed most of the uses of most of the things where gonioscopy is not so informative and we need to do something else for the patient. Am I clearly audible? Huh?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So there are few conditions in which the gonioscopy alone is not sufficient to get information about the patient condition. Although gonioscopy is the gold standard, and any investigation or any other test cannot replace gonioscopy in our clinical practice. So for a PG student, everybody should learn gonioscopy. Initially, it's difficult, but by practice, everybody can learn. So that is the gold standard. First thing to do is gonioscopy, and then they comes the role of imaging other devices. So why it is important to do imaging? Because gonioscopy has certain limitations, and visualization of anterior chamber angle is a critical step in the diagnosis and management of glaucoma, particularly in some special situations. So, and it's an objective method because patient doesn't participate here. So it's an objective method. So most common two tools of imaging anterior segment angle, ASOCT and UBM. Both of them have evolved so much now. ASOCT has evolved so much recently because of the advent of newer generation OCT machines, which give more reliable and repeatable data, and there is less chances of error. So OCT is very easy test to perform. Basically, it takes a cross-sectional image of the structure to be seen, or a structure of interest. So it basically it follows the principle of low coherence interferometry and obtains a cross-sectional image of the anterior segment. And it also has software algorithm to quantify the change or quantify the thing. So it can measure different structures, or that the benefit of having ASOCT. And as it's not operator dependent, so for a beginner, the test is as good as a very skillful operator. So it's not operator dependent like gonioscopy, where you need certain skill and you need experience to have your findings right. So if you compare, if you compare the different generations of ASOCT, initially it was time domain, like other OCT, time domain, then spectral domain. Now there is swept source OCT, which is most great. So in this chart we can see there are different wavelengths of the light where these machines operate. So in the time domain OCT and swept source, they operate in very longer wavelength. So as we know, that more is the wavelength, more will be the depth of penetration of this light. So deeper structure can be seen more clearly if you have a high wavelength of light. But having said that, the time domain OCT, the resolution was not so good. Whereas in swept source OCT, the depth of penetration is very good, as well as the resolution. So that with swept source, we can get more clear information about the structures which are deeply situated, particularly behind the more deeply situated structures. And also the image acquisition rate is much higher, so that you have less error because of the eye movements. So there are two things to assess. One is quantitative assessment and qualitative. The first, qualitative. Qualitative assessment means what structure you can see and identify. So gonioscopy is definitely the gold standard of qualitatively assessing the angle. But ASOCT is supposed to be higher sensitive. It is more sensitive as compared to this, in particularly in case of angle closure glaucoma. So sometimes overestimates also. So we can see here a picture of angle closure, or there is a trabecular iris touch. Quantitative assessment means you can measure or quantify the change also. So this machine has a software algorithm by which it can measure the different and quantify the dimensions of structure of interest, that angle in our case. So the first point to identify here is the scleral spur. So because of the with the help of algorithm, first identify the scleral spur, and based on the scleral spur, it measures different dimensions of angle. So those dimensions I will be describing in details. So as we know, the shallow and shorter axial length known to be a risk factor for angle closure glaucoma, but actually there are other factors also which are responsible, like a high vault, like a very low area of less angle area and less volume. So these are the factors which are is width. These are also factors which are responsible for angle closure attack, apart from short axial length. So this parameter can be studied by ASOCT only. Now this is the picture of a ASOCT, very clear picture of ASOCT. Here I will be describing you parameters, how the ASOCT measures different parameters of the angle. So as I said, the first thing to be identified is scleral spur. So here these 2 points you can see in the picture. If my pointer is being shown there, so these 2 points are scleral spur. Now, if we draw a line connecting these 2 scleral spur, so from this line, the anterior surface of the lens, the distance between the anterior surface of the lens and this line connecting the two between scleral spur is called as lens vault. Higher is the lens vault, there is more chances of angle closure glaucoma. Next is anterior chamber depth. From the posterior surface of the cornea to the anterior surface of the lens is called as anterior chamber depth, as we know. Next is angle opening distance. Now, angle opening distance is the perpendicular distance between trabecular meshwork and the iris, which is calculated around 500 microns anterior to the scleral spur. So you can see in the image, there are a few markings over here. One is 500 microns. So perpendicular distance from the trabecular meshwork to the iris at 500 micron is called as angle opening distance 500. Similarly, if you see something like angle opening distance 750, that means the distance is taken from around 750 micron from the scleral spur. So now there are a few things. IT means iris thickness. So again, the iris thickness is calculated from a particular distance of a definite distance plus 500 microns, 750 micron, and 1500 microns. Now coming to this side, there are 2 other parameters. There are 2 other parameters. One is iris area. So iris area is the cross-sectional thickness of the iris at a particular area, a particular point. Iris curvature is also important parameter, and it's also a risk factor for angle closure glaucoma. Now iris curvature is calculated by drawing a line along the iris pigmented epithelium and from the anterior surface of the distance between anterior surface of the iris to this line, the area where it is maximum. So in that way, iris curvature is calculated. So high iris curvature is also a risk factor for angle closure glaucoma. There is one more parameter here, ARA, or angle recess area. So this recess area is the area which is covered from the angle from inside sclerocorneal wall and from posterior the iris, anterior surface of iris. So the area is also very important landmark and important area to see the risk of angle closure glaucoma. These parameters are very important in studies and can also be important in clinical condition, when, as we know, the angle closure is a progressive disease and the closure of angle or angle dimension keep on changing. So angle becomes more narrow over the course of time. In that way, you can just quantify the change, quantify the measure the parameters, and just keep following that the parameters are actually decreasing or not. That will tell us whether the angle closure is progressive or not. So angle close anterior segment OCT, role of anterior segment OCT for angle closure glaucoma. It's not operator dependent. Yes, it's objective measurement of, and also important for collecting quantitative data. And it can also quantify the change between light and dark condition. And also, after doing a PI, we can see the angle is actually opening up after doing a PI. And this study has demonstrated that angle actually open up slightly after doing a PI, but after few weeks, it starts closing again. So in a period of 6 months, the angle becomes narrow again. Now, few other uses of doing ASOCT here. You can see picture here. Generally, we see patency of for a laser peripheral iridotomy by the trans illumination test. But sometimes this trans illumination test can be misleading. So we see there is trans illumination defect after doing a PI, and it is patent functional. But sometimes it may not be functional. As you can see here, there is a membrane. There is a membrane over this PI area. So this PI is actually not physiologically working. So it's occluded by membrane. So in this case, the PI to establish a flow of fluid between the anterior and posterior segment. So we can actually see whether the PI is fit or not by doing a ASOCT. We can also assess a bleb function by doing, sometimes the bleb is very shallow and we are confused whether it's working or not, or where is the cause of the high intraocular pressure. We can see the bleb. You can see the bleb here clearly visible by doing an ASOCT. Also, with the source OCT, we can actually delineate and quantify the area of PAS. And also in conditions where there is progressive increase in the area of PAS, like neovascular glaucoma, we can quantify the change. So we can actually see the area of PAS, peripheral anterior synechiae, can quantify in terms of clock hours or degree. But there is a limitation. There are a few limitations of ASOCT. Since it's a light, it cannot pass after the iris pigmented epithelium. So it cannot see the structures or document the structure which are present behind the iris pigmented epithelium. For those purposes, you have to depend on other imaging device. So all the disease which affects structures posterior to that cannot be documented or cannot be deleted by ASOCT. So there comes the role of ultrasound biomicroscopy. So it's for assessment of the angles as compared to ASOCT. Reliable, much more frequently used in our clinical practice. It's developed by Pavlin and Foster. So basically, it's an ultrasound like other ultrasound. So what is ultrasound? Ultrasound is nothing but a sound wave which has a frequency more than 20 kilohertz. And this ultrasound has a frequency much higher than a normal routine ultrasound, or these can be used to see retina and posterior segment structure. So it's a very high frequency ultrasound. What happens? What happens when you increase the frequency? Once you increase the frequency, you decrease the wavelength. You decrease the wavelength, so you decrease the penetration, but you improve the resolution. So that exactly happens in UBM. Penetration is less because of the high frequency, but the resolution is very high. So you get more details of the which are anteriorly situated. So you will not get information about the posterior segment structure, but you get more information about structure which are anterior. That is why it has got huge huge role in angle structures, in documented angle structures. And it's very has a very good agreement with gonioscopy in evaluating angle structures in angle closure glaucoma. What is the procedure? Just like ultrasound, you have to go to the ultrasound room, but here you have to keep the patient in supine position. There's a flare which should be filled with the saline, and then this probe actually oxidates, and you can do the scans like sectoral, radial, and transverse scans. So different structures of that. So if you compare overall compare the UBM and ASOCT, both are the objective methods of assessment. One is on sound, is on light. Now, basic difference is the ASOCT is behind the UBM can document and see the structure which is behind the iris. So for all the diseases affecting pars plana, zonules, choroid, and ciliary body, you have to depend on UBM. And UBM is a contact method. ASOCT is non-contact method, we know. For UBM, we have to do supine. Biggest advantage of UBM is if the structure is opaque, if the cornea has scar, so if light cannot pass through the media, UBM is the only investigation or tool by which we can assess the lens and the angles. So UBM has added advantage that it can, since it's sound, so it can be used in opaque media also. Again, again, the parameter which we use in UBM is angle opening. I described already. So it's a distance between the trabecular meshwork and the iris perpendicularly around 250 or 500 microns to the spur. Thickness of iris again can be measured with UBM, and also the curvature. Iris basically will look very shiny here, and also we can assess the zone of contact between the lens and the iris. So and also the synechia we can assess. Curvature also we can document. In the ciliary body, we can see the ciliary body, ciliary sulcus, positioning of the ciliary processes, and misdirection in case of any other disease. Also, supraciliary space we can assess if there is a fluid in supraciliary space. That also we can document. Pupillary block, we have already described this in the last few classes, that when there is a oppositional closure in the pupillary block, there is anterior bowing of the iris. Like you can see here, the bowing of iris because of the position between the lens and the iris, particularly in mid-direct position. So we can see the narrowing of the angle and anterior bowing of the iris. Plateau iris is something in which UBM is used very frequently in our clinical practice. So plateau iris is the abnormal configuration of the angle where the iris takes a sharp backward turn. So iris is flat in the center and takes a little sharp backward turn. Because of the presence of the anteriorly placed ciliary process, it cannot go back. So there is a very small angle recess, and this is the condition where performing a peripheral iridotomy would not help much. That is the point of differentiation, normal angle closure and plateau iris. And in UBM, you can see actual pathology, and the characteristic feature is double hump, presence of double hump on indentation of UBM. Again, any tumor cyst behind the iris, or like here you can see cerebral cyst. So these things can be documented well with the UBM. So these is plateau iris syndrome. So these are also causes of angle closure, particularly unilateral angle closure and of a particular location. Malignant glaucoma. This is very important clinical and not so uncommon clinical condition, generally seen after an insult or after a surgery, particularly in angle closure glaucoma. You do a cataract surgery or a trabeculotomy, you might see a patient end up having malignant glaucoma. So what essentially happens in malignant glaucoma, because of the orientation of ciliary process gets altered, so fluid goes directly into the posterior chamber, and there is forward shifting of the entire lens, iris, and diaphragm. So the anterior chamber is flat in the center and then the periphery as well. So this UBM picture, this clinical picture, you can see the flattening of the anterior chamber. This is uniform flattening of the anterior chamber, and this UBM picture shows the flattening of the anterior chamber here. Pigment dispersion syndrome, we know there is release of pigment and this concavity. So that concavity of the iris can be documented well with the UBM, and after doing a PI, it may reverse also. That you can also document here. A blunt trauma of the eye, you can see and find so many things in the eye with the UBM, like angle recession, iridodialysis, rupture of the lens capsule, rupture of the zonule dialysis, weakening of the zonule. So based on that, you can plan your, so suppose you have a traumatic cataract coming to you in OPD with a trauma and having history of trauma and presented to cataract. So you can plan, after doing a UBM, you can assess how much area of the zonules is functioning or how much area of the zonules is weak. So based on that, you can plan your surgical management, whether you want to use a CTR or you want to do a lensectomy. So that you decide based on the condition of zonules, which can be well documented with UBM. So you can see ciliary body detachment, subluxation, and also non-metallic thorn body can be easily picked up by using a UBM. As similar to OCT, you can also document your evaluate. You can evaluate your filtering surgery, whether your trab is working or not, or what is the problem there. So you can see a spongy appearance with clear fluid here in case of bleb, functional bleb. So take home, this is the conclusive side. The take home message is both are very important tool in imaging the angle structure. None of them can replace the clinical importance of doing a gonioscopy. But then yes, they have their role in our clinical practice and also for your exam. So they have their role in your clinical practice. In such a situation where gonioscopy is not sufficient enough, you have to rely on other findings. And particularly UBM and iris cyst, malignant glaucoma, supraciliary effusion, you have a patient presented with high intraocular pressure after using a particular drug. So that is called as drug-induced glaucoma. In that case, also doing a UBM can document a supraciliary effusion. So these are the conditions where doing an imaging can help you in going right in your management. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prashant. I can understand how difficult it is to concentrate, considering there is no electricity and the howling sounds we are getting through our windows. I'm finding it difficult to listen to your presentation also, but thank you so much for being a part of this program. I think there is one question for you. Before I take that question, I just want to make a small announcement that tomorrow again, 5 p.m. we'll be having two presentations, one on perimetry by Dr. Ronnie George, and there will be another presentation by Dr. Julie Pegu on glaucomatous versus non-glaucomatous optic neuropathy. So tomorrow again, 5 p.m. we'll be having another Zoom meeting. So we'll request you all to join again. Prashant, there's a question that we like, can you explain lens vault again? Just the concept of lens vault, since it's so important. If you have pictures and you want to again explain how to measure lens vault and what is the importance of lens vault.
Yes.
Madam, are you around?
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am.
So lens vault basically indicates how curvy is your lens. So how thicker is your lens and the anterior surface, how curved is the anterior surface. So in case of hypermetropes or extreme hypermetropes, you have a very high lens vault. Also in case of certain cases, special cases, they have high lens vault. So what is lens vault? It is a distance from, first you draw a line connecting two scleral spurs. So in an eye, you draw a line connecting two scleral spurs. Now the distance from this line to the anterior surface of the lens is called lens vault. So higher is this distance, more curve you have in the lens.
Share your picture, Prashant. We're not able to see the.
Yeah, I can share.
If it is possible,
Yeah, I can share.
then we can understand.
I think the concept of lens vault came into being with the idea that it's not just that the lenses are thick in angle closure eyes, they're also slightly anteriorly placed. So this is measuring the anterior convexity. I can just share the slide, yes. And
Is it visible, this slide?
Yeah, visible.
Yeah. So this is the line connecting two scleral spur. From there, the distance between from the anterior lens surface or lens capsule, the distance called lens vault. You can see the arrow here, the lens vault. So lens vault, the lower end of the arrow is from the line connecting two scleral spur.
Yeah. Thank you, Prashant. Madam, do you use this lens vault in your practice to decide your plan of management?
yeah, so I'll tell you what, where they were talking about indications of UBM. So at work, what we have as indication for UBM is that ideally every patient where you're doing a YAG laser peripheral iridotomy in patients either who are PACS or PAC or PACG, and then when you repeat their gonioscopy after laser PI and you still have residual appositional angle closure, we like to do the UBM if possible in these patients to get the idea of which other mechanisms are at play, and also to understand if cataract surgery or lens extraction can benefit these patients, especially if their pressures are still uncontrolled, or sometimes in some situations where we choose to recommend lens surgery. In those cases, we do like to do imaging. I'm not a great fan of ASOCT, and I think as Dr. Prashant was telling, what postgraduates also to understand that if they're playing with the Cirrus kind of a machine, which is primarily a retina OCT machine, the normal head that does ASOCT actually doesn't do ASOCT limbus to limbus. So then it becomes extremely difficult to do any quantifiable measurements. But if you buy another attachment onto the Cirrus, which allows you to do limbus to limbus, at least you can get some idea about the anterior chamber depth and all. But it's the UBM that is a great tool to have, especially to measure things like lens vault, or in young patients who have angle closure to look for posterior pushing mechanisms like iris cysts or ciliary body cysts. So we've seen a lot of that happening in younger angle closure eyes. So we do lens vault in situations where we've done PI, pressures are still high, the cataract is not much. We are looking at the lens thickness and the lens vault to understand if this patient might benefit by removing this lens and opening the angle further and finishing the residual appositional closure in the eye. That's when we use it.
Thank you, madam. There are some people are posting that they want a link of this presentation, so they can mail it to Dr. Satyajit Sinha. His email address has been shared in all the flyers, and he will provide you the link later on. And madam, one more question, very simple, basic question is, what is the definition of occludable angles?
Oh, very good. So if you look at the classification, in the presentation, I didn't dwell over there. If you look at the classification of primary angle closure, suspect primary angle closure and primary angle closure glaucoma, then the debate was whether 180-degree appositional closure, that means in 2 quadrants, if you cannot see the PTM without indenting, we call it PSCS and advocate laser play or not. Or is it 3 quadrants? But in the last few years, all of us have started to take the PACS criteria as 2 quadrants. Now, there are some articles published by Tingon and all where occludable angles is a vague terminology. Occludable angle is any patient who has shallow AC and some amount of appositional closure. So even 90 degrees, which is 1 quadrant of ITC, is called occludable angle. But whether every occludable angle needs PI is another, debate to happen. So we don't use the word occludable angles. We use the word the patient is a primary angle closure suspect or primary angle closure, and with the extent of ITC or appositional closure, 2 quadrants, 3 quadrants. So anything beyond 2 quadrants is occludable if you want to ask in terms of PI.
There is another interesting question that you're doing gonioscopy. At 1 quadrant, you are seeing sclera spur, another quadrant, you are seeing trabecular meshwork, and maybe 3rd quadrant, you are seeing Solvay's line. So what will be the grade of the angle?
Yeah, so see, when you have a very variable angle, like you're saying in 1 angle quadrant, you can see pretty much nothing but Solvay's line. Then you have in 1 travel. So the overall grading, when you see an apposition, you have to explain what's happening. To me, the moment you see an angle where without indentation, you have patches where you see the sclera spur and patches there is nothing. Now, this is a patient who doesn't have pupillary block, but another mechanism for second angle closure. Now, either it's uveitis, either it's partly posterior pushing somewhere, because otherwise you will not have this configuration of 1 angle quadrant completely closed and 1 quadrant completely open without indentation. With indentation, I understand, because areas which are not synically closed will open up, the others will not. But without pressing, if you have 1 area, only Solvay's line, 1 area, ciliary body band, then there's something else happening. This is secondary angle closure taking place. And how do you grade it? You grade in all quadrants. You write what you see, as Dr. Manish also said, the maximum or the last angle structure visible.
Okay. So each quadrant you have. And there is another question. Normally, we can't see Stem's canal. Can we see Stem's canal?
No, you can't. If there's blood in it, of course, you can see it. But normally, you can't see it.
In that part, we have already discussed the blood. I think most of the questions have been covered. And there is another question. Prashant, you can take this question. How you see Van Herrick's, how you describe entry chamber depth with Van Herrick's in a case of entry chamber IOL? Do you think it's different, or
entry chamber?
do you use a iris or a lens to describe Van Herrick's in an entry chamber IOL patient?
Anterior chamber, what? IA?
When you doing a grading with Van Herrick's, so we take the posterior surface of cornea and the anterior surface of iris. So if you have an anterior chamber IOL, AC IOL. So in this case, when your Van Herrick's will be different, will you use the AC IOL as a criteria, or will you use the iris as a criteria?
Again, I think iris should be taken as a criteria again here.
So it's a very actually interesting question, isn't it, madam?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question and another indication to do gonioscopy. The moment you have an AC IOL in place is a beautiful tool to look at where the haptics are resting in the angle. And there are some patients who land up having high pressures or whatever. Looking at Van Herrick, the definition of Van Herrick is the distance between the peripheral cornea and the iris. So you will have to look at that. Now, where is it's placed and what is it doing. The anterior chamber depth has no role. Now you have to look at the angle. The entire depth, if it's shallow because the pupillary block is happening, there is no PI, that's a different question. And see, the moment you have to remember, when there is pupillary block happening in angle closure, it can be very bulgy also. Some areas the iris will come and touch the posterior corneal surface and some it might not. But Von Herrick is only the criteria of the distance between posterior corneal surface and anterior iris surface. So you will not change that definition. But you will mention, and in ACIOL, it can be variable. You might have different Von Herrick or different chamber depth in different quadrants or different clock hours also sometimes.
Thank you, madam. I think we have covered most of the question. This is the last question. What is normal value of lens vault?
So if you look at the lens vault values, what we are looking at, I also don't look at so much the values, but I think if you look at there was a study by Singapore where they looked at the sensitivity and specificity of lens vault, lens thickness and all. And I think it is 4.8 or something of the lens thickness. Beyond that, they looked at risk of angle closure being very high. And I think in the lens vault, again, they looked at 672, not microns, but millimicrons as the reference point for them to say that the chances of angle closure became. I hope I'm using the right number, but this is pretty much the cutoff that that study published, documented.
Thank you, madam. So I think there's one more question: how to identify corneal wedge in temporal and nasal angle? I think it's similar to what we do in superior and inferior. Just we need to tilt
the slit beam from horizontal, or from vertical to horizontal. Only then, but it's easier to identify it in the superior inferior mirror.
So we have covered most of the questions, and some people who are interested to get the YouTube link, they can mail it to Dr. Satyajit. Sir will be sharing the link. I will already announced that tomorrow again 5 p.m. we'll have presentations on perimetry and glaucomatous versus non-glaucomatous discs. So I'll again thank Madam Dr. Reena. Madam, it was lovely. Although I must say I was not able to concentrate that well as would have loved to. And thank you so much, Prashant. Like Prashant, now also I'm sort of staying in dark. So our house also the electricity is gone. So I'll hand over to Dr. Satyajit to please close the session.
Thank you, Manish. I must admit that since morning, Manish was so worried. He downloaded an app to monitor the cyclone of how close it is getting to Calcutta, and when there will be electricity and when there won't be electricity. He has his whole heart and soul into this PG program, and he didn't want anything to get interrupted. And I'm so grateful to him. And I think now Prashant and Manish, they have a torch light on, or I don't know what it is.
This is the mobile light.
And his laptop
it shows
I have 2 laptops, so the laptop is...
It shows your amazing dedication and devotion towards this program. Once again, I'm very grateful to Dr. Reena for the amazing presentation that she did, and for all her time and contribution to this program. I hope we get an opportunity and time to invite her once again to this program on another topic. Dr. Prashant did an amazing job with all the uncertainties before the presentation. He was looking at the light and it was flickering and he was getting anxious, and all sorts of things happen at the same time. Your battery will run out, your electricity will run out, so on and so forth. Like it happened for me in Patna just before the session started, everything had gone off. But God has been kind and everything came together. Amazing presentations, amazing questions, and amazing sessions. All of this has been recorded, and if you want a link to it, you can write to me at eyesinha@gmail.com. That is eyesinha@gmail.com, and I will send you a recording of this, which comes a little later from Zoom. Once again, I'd like to also specially thank all the participants. We had about 90 to 95 participants today, and we were a little anxious that because of the cyclone, there may be lesser participants. But we are very happy that for all those who joined. For those who couldn't join, I'm sure I've already started receiving emails for the request for the YouTube link, which I'll send them. But thank you so much once again, Dr. Manish, for the amazing job that you do, for anchoring so well. Thank you, Dr. Reena, and thank you, Dr. Prashant, once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Very brave of you all and very dedicated, of course. Thank you and all the best. I'm sure you'll all be fine and this thing will also pass by. and stay safe. Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.